No one at the county farm auction paid much attention to the old tractor parked at the far end of the equipment row. Its faded red paint had almost disappeared beneath years of rust. One headlight hung loose from a cracked housing. The seat was torn, exposing yellow foam that had long since hardened under the sun. Dry weeds poked through the rear axle, making it look less like a machine and more like part of the abandoned fence behind it. Farmers walked past without slowing down. Some shook their heads, others laughed. That thing's worth more by the pound than as a tractor. It'll cost twice as much to fix as it's worth. Whoever buys that scrap must enjoy wasting money. Most bidders gathered around newer equipment with enclosed cabs, shiny paint, and digital displays. Even the older tractors that looked presentable attracted far more attention than the rusted machine sitting quietly at the edge of the lot. Emma noticed something different. She didn't stop at the peeling paint. She crouched beside the front axle and ran her hand across the heavy cast-iron frame. She checked underneath for fresh oil stains. She slowly turned the cooling fan by hand. Then she leaned over the engine bay, listening carefully as if the silent machine still had something to say. The auctioneer watched with mild curiosity. "You actually thinking about this one?" he asked. Emma smiled but didn't answer. Around her, several farmers exchanged amused looks. One elderly rancher chuckled. "Haven't seen anybody inspect that old girl in years." Another man folded his arms. "She's looking at junk." Emma continued checking every detail. She wasn't admiring the tractor, she was reading it. Years of helping her grandfather repair old farm equipment had taught her something few people at the auction seemed to remember. Rust tells you how something was stored, oil tells you how it was treated, but neither one tells you whether the machine still has years of honest work left inside it. The auctioneer finally climbed onto the trailer. Next up, one vintage diesel tractor selling as no guarantees. The opening bid barely reached a few $100. Silence, no hands. The auctioneer lowered the price again. Still nothing, people were already turning toward the next lot. Then Emma quietly raised her bidder card. "I'll take it." A ripple of laughter spread across the crowd. Someone near the front called out, "Hope you brought another tractor to haul that one home." Another added, "You're buying yourself the most expensive pile of rust in the county." Emma didn't respond when the bidding closed only seconds later. She counted out the cash she had saved for nearly 3 years, every dollar, no financing, no loan, no second thoughts. As the old tractor was loaded onto a trailer, several people stood watching with smiles that mixed amusement and disbelief. To them, the story was already over. A young woman had just thrown away her savings on a machine everyone else had rejected. None of them noticed the quiet confidence on Emma's face. And none of them imagined that before the harvest ended, many of those same people would drive down her gravel lane not to laugh, but to ask a single question. "Would you sell us that tractor?" As the trailer carrying the old tractor disappeared down the county road, many people at the auction believed they had just witnessed an expensive mistake. What they didn't know was that Emma hadn't bought the tractor on impulse. She had been preparing for that moment for most of her life. Long before she ever dreamed of owning a farm, she spent nearly every Saturday in her grandfather Walter's weathered machine shed. While other children rode bicycles or played video games, Emma handed him wrenches, cleaned greasy bolts, and listened to stories that seemed far older than the machines they worked on. Walter had repaired tractors for more than 40 years. He had watched generations of farmers replace dependable equipment with newer models, convinced that newer always meant better. Sometimes it did. Many times it didn't. Whenever someone hauled in a tractor with faded paint and dented fenders, Walter never looked at the body first. He always opened the hood. "The paint is for the neighbors," he used to say with a smile. "The engine is for the farmer." Emma never forgot those words. She remembered watching him tap gently on an engine block with the handle of a wrench. Listening to the sound as if he could hear the machine's entire history. She remembered him wiping away dirt to inspect casting numbers, checking hydraulic lines with patient hands, and turning crankshafts one careful inch at a time. Every inspection followed the same quiet rhythm. Never rush, never assume. Look deeper. One afternoon when Emma was about 12 years old, From an old dairy farmer arrived with a tractor that looked even worse than the one she had just bought at auction. Rust covered nearly every panel, the tires were cracked. One fender was missing completely. From Emma whispered to her grandfather, "Is it even worth fixing?" Walter smiled without looking up. "What do you see?" She shrugged. "An old tractor." He nodded. "That's what everyone sees." Then he pointed beneath the hood. "What do you not see?" She didn't know how to answer. Walter rested a hand on the engine. "This block isn't cracked." He pointed toward the transmission housing. These gears were built to outlive the paint. He spun the power takeoff shaft slowly by hand, and this old diesel still turns freely. Only then did he stand up and wipe the grease from his hands. Never confused neglect with failure. Those words stayed with Emma long after the tractor left the shop. Over the years, she learned that appearance often tells the smallest part of a machine's story. A faded hood might simply mean years spent working honestly beneath the sun. Surface rust could come from sitting outside through forgotten winters. Even torn seats and dented panels rarely decided whether a tractor could still spend another decade in the field. The real questions were always hidden deeper. Did the engine still have good compression? Was the transmission sound? Did the hydraulics hold pressure? Could replacement parts still be found? Those were the questions Walter taught her to ask. Years later, after Walter passed away, Emma inherited neither his land nor his workshop. She inherited something far more valuable, his way of looking at things. So when everyone else at the auction saw an old tractor that looked ready for the scrapyard, Emma wasn't looking at rust, she was looking for evidence, and little by little, she was finding exactly what her grandfather had taught her to recognize. The old tractor arrived at Emma's farm just before sunset. Its tires barely held enough air to roll off the trailer. The battery was dead. The steering wheel wobbled. Every panel carried another layer of faded paint, rust, or scratches collected from decades of work. If someone had driven past the property that evening, they would have seen exactly what the people at the auction saw. An old machine that had reached the end of its life. Emma saw something entirely different. She rolled open the barn doors, swept away years of dust from an empty work bay, and parked the tractor beneath a single hanging light. For several minutes, she simply stood there. Not touching it, not trying to start it, just looking. Her grandfather had always insisted that the first inspection should begin with patience. Machines often reveal their stories before a single wrench is picked up. Emma walked slowly around the tractor. She noticed the hitch first. The drawbar was worn smooth from years of pulling heavy loads, but it wasn't bent. That told her the tractor had worked hard without being abused. Next came the rear axle housings. They were stained with old grease but showed no signs of major cracks or fresh leaks. She knelt beside one of the massive rear tires and brushed away decades of dirt packed around the wheel hub. Still dry, still solid. Then she lifted the hood. The engine compartment looked neglected but not destroyed. Mouse nests filled one corner near the battery tray. A few brittle wires needed replacing. The fuel filters were coated with grime, but the engine block itself caught her attention immediately. No visible freeze cracks, no rough welds, no patches where someone had tried to repair catastrophic damage. She smiled. "That's interesting." Emma reached for a long breaker bar and carefully placed it on the crankshaft pulley. She applied steady pressure. Nothing happened at first. She pushed a little harder. Then, the engine moved only a few degrees. But it moved. She stopped immediately. Not because she was disappointed, because that small movement answered the biggest question of all. The engine wasn't seized. For most people, that tiny shift would have meant almost nothing. For Emma, it meant everything. A diesel engine locked solid after years of sitting can require a complete rebuild or may never run again. But one that still turns, even slowly, often has a chance if the internal components have been protected from severe corrosion. She didn't celebrate. She simply wrote 3 words in the small notebook she carried everywhere. Engine still free. One clue? Nothing more. She continued her inspection. The hydraulic pump housing looked intact. The transmission case carried decades of dirt but no obvious fractures. Even the pita shaft rotated by hand after a little effort. Another note. Pita turns freely, then another. Hydraulic lines original. Each observation by itself meant very little. From together they began telling a different story than the rust on the outside. Emma wasn't trying to convince herself that the tractor was perfect. She knew it wasn't. It would need work. From probably more work than most people were willing to do, but perfection had never been the goal. Dependability was. She closed the hood and stepped back. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the corn stubble beyond the barn. From inside, the old tractor remained silent. Yet for the first time since the auction, Emma felt certain she hadn't bought a mistake. She had bought a puzzle, and unlike everyone else at the auction, she knew how to read the first pieces. What she didn't know yet was whether the rest of the story hidden inside that engine would reward her faith or prove every laugh at the auction had been justified. Emma didn't begin by ordering expensive parts. She didn't strip the tractor down to bare metal. She didn't even think about paint. Her grandfather had always said the same thing whenever an old machine arrived in his shop. Never fix what isn't broken. So, before buying a single replacement part, Emma made a list. Fuel, air, oil, cooling, electricity. Every engine needed those 5 systems to work together. If she could inspect each one carefully, the tractor would tell her what it needed and, just as importantly, what it didn't. The fuel tank came first. She removed the cap and shined a flashlight inside. Years of sitting had left a layer of dark sludge settled across the bottom. The diesel smelled stale. Water droplets clung to the inside walls. No engine could run properly on fuel like that. She drained every gallon, flushed the tank, and cleaned the sediment until fresh metal appeared beneath the grime. Next came the fuel lines. Several rubber hoses had become brittle with age. One cracked the moment she bent it. She replaced every questionable line before it had the chance to become a bigger problem. The fuel filters were worse. When she removed the first filter, thick black residue coated nearly every surface, she smiled to herself. If nobody ever changed these, she whispered. The engine never really had a fair chance. Fresh filters went on. Clean diesel followed, one problem solved. Then she crawled beneath the tractor with a drain pan. The engine oil poured out as slowly as cold syrup. It was darker than she expected. But there were no shiny metal flakes hiding in the drain pan that mattered. Metal fragments could mean serious internal damage. Their absence suggested years of neglect, but not necessarily years of destruction. She replaced the oil, installed a new filter, moved on. The cooling system needed attention next. Old coolant had almost disappeared. A few hoses felt soft enough to squeeze flat with one hand. Those were easy decisions. New hoses, fresh coolant, no shortcuts. As daylight faded, Emma turned her attention to the electrical system. The old battery was beyond saving. Several wire connections had turned green with corrosion. She cleaned every terminal one by one until bright metal appeared again. A new battery slid into place. For the first time in years, electricity flowed through the tractor exactly as its designers intended. Still, she didn't reach for the ignition key. Not yet. One last step remained. She removed the injectors and added a small amount of lubricant into each cylinder before slowly rotating the engine by hand several more times. Nothing scraped, nothing locked. Each rotation became smoother than the last. She stopped and listened. Silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of a forgotten machine. The silence of something waiting. Outside the barn, headlights swept across the driveway. Her neighbor, Carl, climbed out of his pickup after hearing she'd hauled home the auction tractor. He walked inside, looked at the machine, and laughed softly. "You've spent 2 days cleaning junk." Emma wiped her hands on an old shop towel. "I've spent 2 days learning what it needs." Carl shook his head. For what you've paid already, you could have put that money toward something newer." Emma smiled. "Maybe." Carl glanced at the faded hood. "I still think it'll never run." After he left, the barn grew quiet again. Emma stood beside the tractor, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. Everything she could inspect without starting the engine had been checked. Everything that deserved attention had received it. Now there was only one question left. She climbed into the cracked vinyl seat, turned the key halfway. The dashboard lights flickered to life. She waited a few seconds for the electrical system to settle. Then her hand wrapped around the ignition switch once more. If her grandfather had taught her correctly, the next sound inside that old barn would change everything. Emma took one slow breath before turning the key. The rest of the way, the starter groaned once, twice. The old diesel rolled over with a heavy rhythm that echoed through the quiet barn. Nothing. She waited a few seconds and tried again. The engine cranked longer this time. A puff of gray smoke drifted from the exhaust stack. Then another. The smell of old diesel filled the air. Come on, she whispered. One more turn. Suddenly the engine coughed, shook violently, coughed again, then with a deep rumble that seemed almost impossible after years of silence. The tractor came to life. The entire barn vibrated. Dust drifted from the rafters. The exhaust barked unevenly before settling into a slow, steady idle. Emma couldn't help smiling. Not because the tractor sounded perfect. It didn't. The idle wandered slightly, and every now and then the engine stumbled for a heartbeat before recovering, but it was running. After years of sitting forgotten at the edge of someone's field, the old machine had spoken again. Emma shut it down after only a few minutes. Her grandfather had taught her another important lesson. The first start isn't the victory. The first day of work is. For the next several mornings, she let the engine warm up a little longer each time. She checked for fresh oil leaks. Watched the temperature gauge, listened for unusual noises. Everything seemed promising. By the end of the week, she decided the tractor was ready for its first real job. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just pulling a small disc harrow across one of the neglected fields behind the barn, the soil had become compacted after years without proper cultivation. If the tractor could handle this, it could handle almost anything else she needed that season. As the old diesel rolled into the field, a familiar pickup slowed on the road. Carl, he leaned against his open window. Watching with folded arms. "I'll admit," he called out, "I'm surprised you got it running." Emma waved. Carl smiled. "Let's see how long it lasts." Emma eased the tractor into gear. The harrow dropped into the ground. For the first 100 yards, everything felt exactly right. The engine pulled steadily. The transmission shifted smoothly. Fresh earth rolled gently behind the blades. Emma allowed herself to believe the hardest part might already be over. Then the engine stumbled. Once, twice. Without warning, the power disappeared. The tractor lurched forward one final time before falling completely silent. The only sound left was the wind moving across the field. Emma sat quietly for a moment. Across the road, Carl removed his cap and shook his head. "I knew it," he muttered within minutes. Two more neighbors stopped their trucks. Nobody said anything cruel. They didn't need to. Their expressions said enough. The old tractor had finally proven what everyone believed from the beginning. Emma climbed down without saying a word. She didn't kick the tire, she didn't curse, she didn't panic. Instead, she reached for her toolbox. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. When an old machine quits suddenly, don't assume the engine has failed. Ask what the engine stopped receiving. Fuel, air, or compression. One of those answers was almost always waiting. She loosened the fuel bleeder screw. Only a weak trickle emerged. Not enough, she removed the sediment bowl beneath the fuel tank. It was nearly packed solid with decades of rust flakes. Dirt and thick deposits that had broken loose after the tractor began running regularly again. Emma smiled. "So that's where you've been hiding." The engine hadn't failed. The fuel had. Cleaning the tank had removed years of old buildup, but once fresh diesel began flowing through the system, tiny particles that had remained stuck inside the tank slowly worked their way loose. Little by little, they traveled through the fuel line until they collected exactly where they were designed to stop. The sediment bowl had done its job. It had protected the engine. It had simply become full. Emma cleaned the bowl thoroughly, flushed the remaining line, bled the air from the fuel system, and climbed back into the seat. Carl was still watching. So?" he called. "Finished already?" Emma smiled without answering. She turned the key. The engine fired almost immediately. A few moments later, the tractor eased forward once again. Pulling the harrow across the field as though nothing had happened. Carl stood silently beside his truck. For the first time since the auction, he wasn't laughing. He was paying attention. Because maybe. The young woman hadn't bought a broken tractor after all. She had bought a machine that simply needed someone patient enough to understand it. Word traveled quickly through the farming community. Not because Emma had restored an old tractor, Plenty of people had done that before. What surprised everyone was that the rusty machine kept showing up in the field day after day. It wasn't breaking down. It wasn't being hauled home behind another tractor. It was working every morning before sunrise. The familiar rumble echoed across the valley. By breakfast, Emma was already moving compost, pulling wagons, or preparing another section of ground for planting. The tractor wasn't fast. It didn't have air conditioning. There was no touchscreen. No GPS, no automatic steering, just gears, steel, and an engine that seemed happier the longer it worked. One afternoon, Carl stopped at the edge of the field again. This time he wasn't smiling. He watched as Emma pulled a loaded wagon stacked with compost toward the vegetable plots. The old tractor moved steadily, never sounding rushed when she shut the engine down. Carl walked over. "I've been trying to figure something out," he admitted. Emma wiped the dust from her hands. "What's that? How is that old thing pulling so well?" She looked back at the faded machine. It isn't trying to be fast." Carl frowned. "What do you mean?" Emma rested one boot on the drawbar. "Most people judge tractors by horsepower." She smiled. "My grandfather judged them by how they delivered that power." Carl stayed quiet. She continued. "This engine makes its pulling power at low speed." She pointed toward the rear wheels. "It doesn't need to race, it just keeps pulling." Carl looked across the freshly worked field. "I always thought newer meant stronger sometimes," Emma replied, "but not always where it matters." Her grandfather had explained it years before, using nothing more than an old oak log. He tied one rope to a small pickup truck, another to an aging farm tractor. The pickup had more speed, more comfort, even more horsepower on paper, but when both tried pulling the heavy log across wet ground, the tractor barely seemed to notice the weight. The lesson had never left her. Machines built for steady pulling behaved differently from machines built for speed. That difference couldn't always be captured by a sales brochure. Over the next several weeks, Emma learned something even more important. The tractor naturally encouraged her to slow down. Instead of rushing through every job, she began paying closer attention to the fields themselves. She noticed where rainwater lingered after storms. She recognized patches of soil that stayed darker and richer. She found compacted areas that needed lighter passes instead of repeated heavy traffic. Working more slowly allowed her to see details she had missed before. The tractor wasn't just changing the way she farmed, it was changing the way she observed the land one evening. After finishing another long day, Emma parked beside a neighboring field where a massive modern tractor sat idling. Its owner climbed down and stretched his back. "How many acres did you finish today?" He asked. Emma named a number. The farmer laughed. "I covered twice that, I'm sure you did," Emma answered. Then she looked across her own field. Every compost pile had been spread. Every bed had been shaped. Nothing needed to be done twice. She smiled politely. "I wasn't trying to finish first." The man shrugged and drove away. Emma watched the dust settle behind him. For a long moment, she looked at the old tractor standing quietly beside the barn. Its faded paint hadn't changed. Its rust hadn't disappeared. If anything, it looked even older now that it carried fresh dirt from weeks of honest work. But something else had changed. People had stopped asking why she bought it. Now they were asking how it kept working. And for Emma, those were two very different questions. Because once people stop laughing, they usually start learning. By the middle of summer, the old tractor had become part of Emma's daily routine. Every morning, before the first light reached the fields, its familiar diesel rumble echoed across the property. It pulled compost wagons, moved irrigation pipes, carried fencing supplies, dragged a small seed drill across newly prepared ground. None of those jobs looked impressive on their own. But together they quietly transformed the farm. Emma often thought about something her grandfather used to say. "Most people think harvest begins when the crops are ready." He would shake his head. Harvest begins the day you make the first good decision." Only now did she fully understand what he meant. The old tractor wasn't producing vegetables, it wasn't growing corn, it wasn't making tomatoes sweeter or pumpkins larger. It was doing something even more important. It made every other job possible, without borrowing equipment, without waiting for neighbors, without making another loan payment. Every load of compost reached the fields on time. Every seed went into prepared soil. Every repair happened when it needed to happen, not weeks later. Little by little, those ordinary decisions began adding up one afternoon. Emma walked through the vegetable rows carrying nothing more than a notebook. The tomatoes stood taller than they had only a month before. Beans climbed their supports in thick green walls. Sweet corn stretched above her shoulders. She knelt and pressed one hand into the soil. It crumbled easily between her fingers. Earlier that spring, the ground had been hard enough to resist a shovel after several dry days. Now it felt different. Months of compost, careful cultivation, and fewer unnecessary passes across the field had slowly improved the surface. The change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't magic. It was simply the result of doing many small things well. Behind her, the old tractor sat beneath an oak tree, its engine ticking softly as it cooled after another morning of work. Its faded hood still carried scratches from decades of use. Rust still marked the edges of the fenders. Nothing about its appearance suggested success. Emma smiled. Neither did hers. Her gloves were stained, her boots were caked with mud, her shirt carried streaks of grease from replacing a hydraulic hose earlier that morning. Success on a farm rarely looked polished. Late that afternoon, Carl pulled into the driveway again. This time he didn't come to offer advice. He climbed out slowly and looked across the fields. "I drove past your place a month ago." He said, "It didn't look like this." Emma followed his gaze. The rows were straighter. The cover crops between sections had filled in. Even the areas that once struggled after heavy rain now looked healthier. "It's amazing what steady work can do," she replied. Carl nodded quietly. "I thought that tractor would spend more time in your shop than your field." Emma laughed. "It has spent plenty of time in the shop." Carl looked surprised. But only after work. She explained that every evening she inspected the tractor while problems were still small. A loose bolt, a worn belt, a leaking hose. Nothing was ignored simply because the machine was still running. Her grandfather had always believed that maintenance wasn't something you did after a breakdown, it was how you prevented one. Carl rested one hand on the old tractor's hood, he paused. "I think we've all been looking at the wrong thing." Emma tilted her head. "We kept looking at the tractor." He glanced across the thriving fields. "When we should have been looking at what it was helping you build." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the corn. Swallows skimmed low across the pasture. Chasing insects in the fading light, the farm felt alive. Not because one old tractor had changed everything overnight, but because it had quietly made hundreds of good decisions possible. Emma looked across the fields one last time before closing the barn doors. Harvest was still weeks away, the bins were empty, no profits had been counted, no one had admitted they were wrong. Not yet. But for the first time since the auction, she no longer needed proof that she had made the right decision. The land was already beginning to tell the story soon. Everyone else would hear it too. By late August, Emma's fields had become difficult to ignore. From the county road, the difference was obvious. Her vegetable rows were uniform. The corn stood taller than many neighboring fields. Even the pasture she'd nearly given up on in the spring now carried a healthy cover of green. People noticed, but noticing wasn't the same as believing. At the feed store, conversations began to change. Maybe she just had better weather. I heard she bought expensive fertilizer. She's probably spending more money than anyone realizes. No one mentioned the old tractor anymore. Instead, they searched for another explanation, anything that made more sense than admitting they'd judged too quickly. Emma heard the rumors but rarely answered them. She had learned that arguments seldom changed minds. Results did. One afternoon, Carl stopped by carrying a box of hydraulic fluid. "I figured you might need this sooner or later," he said with a grin. Emma laughed. "Planning for another breakdown?" Carl shrugged. Planning ahead, she accepted the box with a smile. The old tractor had indeed needed attention over the past several weeks. A leaking hydraulic hose, a loose fan belt, one worn wheel bearing. Nothing unexpected, nothing expensive. Every repair had been caught early because Emma inspected the machine every evening before locking the barn. Small problems never had the chance to become large ones. That habit, more than anything else, kept the tractor dependable. Carl watched as she wiped a little grease from the steering linkage. He admitted, "I used to think fixing old equipment meant constantly chasing problems." From Emma tightened the last bolt before looking up. It does, Carl frowned. She smiled. But I'd rather chase small problems than pay for big ones. He stood quietly for a moment, considering her words. From across the road, another farmer slowed his pickup and rolled down the window. Looks like you're having another repair day. Emma nodded. Just routine maintenance, the man laughed. From my new tractor hasn't needed a wrench all season. Emma wished him well and returned to work. 3 days later, that same tractor passed her farm again. This time it wasn't moving under its own power. From a service truck followed behind it. The large machine had suffered an electronic fault during field work and needed specialized diagnostics before it could return to service. Emma watched the convoy disappear over the hill. From she felt no satisfaction. Machines fail. Old ones, new ones. That was simply part of farming. The difference wasn't whether something broke. It was whether the farmer could solve the problem before the weather changed. From the following week, dark clouds gathered across the valley. Weather forecasts predicted several days of heavy rain. Every farmer knew what that meant. The remaining fields had to be finished before the first storm arrived. From engines started before dawn all across the county, combines rolled, hay balers hurried across open fields, every hour mattered. Emma climbed onto her old tractor before sunrise. From it started on the first turn of the key. As it settled into its familiar steady idle, she rested one hand on the steering wheel and looked toward the eastern sky. The clouds were already building. This wasn't the day for speed, it was the day for reliability. Because when rain is only hours away, the tractor that shows up is worth far more than the one that impresses people in the dealership parking lot. By sunset, Emma had finished every field she planned to harvest that week. The first drops of rain began falling. Just as she backed the old tractor into the barn, she shut off the engine. For a moment, the only sound was rain striking the metal roof. She smiled quietly. Outside, the storm rolled across the county. Inside, the old tractor rested exactly where it belonged. Ready for tomorrow. And although very few people realized it yet, the most important victory of the season had just taken place. Not in the harvest, but in the hours before it. The rain passed after 3 days. When the clouds finally broke apart, sunlight spilled across the valley, revealing fields that had changed almost overnight. Some farmers were still waiting for the ground to dry enough to continue working. Others were repairing equipment that had failed during the rush before the storm. Emma simply opened the barn doors. The old tractor started on the first turn of the key, as always. She drove toward the first field without excitement or celebration. Harvest wasn't the time for emotions. It was the time for answers. For weeks, every decision she had made would finally be measured against reality. The vegetable plots were harvested first. Crates filled one after another, tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash. Every load was carried from the field by the same faded tractor that many people had once called scrap metal. Emma worked quietly. She wasn't counting compliments, she was counting crates. Each evening she opened a weathered notebook that had belonged to her grandfather. Inside, she wrote only facts. Hours worked, fuel used, repairs completed, harvest collected, income received. When she finished adding the numbers after the first week, she stopped for a long moment. Then she checked the calculations again. The results surprised even her. The farm had spent far less money than she had expected. Not because the crops sold for extraordinary prices, not because yields had broken any records. But because almost every major expense had already been avoided. She hadn't borrowed money for expensive equipment. She hadn't made monthly loan payments. Most repairs had cost little more than replacement parts and her own time. The old tractor hadn't made the farm rich. It had allowed the farm to stay efficient. That difference mattered. A few days later, Carl stopped by carrying a basket of fresh apples from his orchard. I heard you've already finished most of your harvest, he said. Emma nodded. We're ahead of schedule. Carl looked toward the tractor sitting beside the packing shed. I've been thinking about something. Emma waited. When you bought that thing, he said with a laugh. I figured the cheapest part would be buying it. Emma smiled, and now Carl shook his head slowly. Turns out the expensive tractors aren't always the cheaper choice. Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up a handful of soil beside the packing shed. She let it crumble gently through her fingers. From my grandfather used to tell me that every dollar you don't have to spend is a dollar your farm gets to keep. Carl looked across the property. Nothing about the place looked luxurious. The barn still needed paint. Several fences leaned slightly. The tractor still carried rust across its hood. Yet everything worked. Every gate opened. Every field had been harvested. Every tool had a purpose. The farm wasn't impressive because it looked expensive. It was impressive because almost nothing was wasted. As word spread through the county, people who had ignored Emma's farm all summer began driving past more often. Some slowed down. Others stopped. No one laughed anymore. Instead, they asked different questions. How many hours are on that tractor? What model is it? Where do you even find parts? Emma answered every question patiently. She never claimed old tractors were better than new ones. She simply explained that the right machine depends on the job, the budget, and the person willing to care for it. For some farmers, a modern tractor made perfect sense. For her small operation, this old machine had made more sense than any monthly payment ever could. Late that evening, after the final trailer returned from the fields, Emma parked the tractor inside the barn. She shut off the engine and listened as the familiar ticking of cooling metal filled the silence. Months earlier, people had looked at this machine and seen only what it had been. Now they were beginning to understand what it had made possible. The harvest hadn't changed the tractor. The harvest had changed the people looking at it, and the biggest surprise was still waiting. The county's annual fall farmers gathering arrived only 2 weeks after Emma finished harvesting. Every year, growers from across the area met to exchange ideas, compare yields, and more often than not, compare equipment. It wasn't an official competition, but everyone quietly paid attention to who had struggled and who had quietly succeeded. Emma almost didn't attend. There was still fencing to repair before winter, machinery to clean, and compost piles to turn. But Carl insisted. "You should come," he said. "They've been talking about your farm all month." Emma smiled. "I hope that's a good thing," Carl laughed. "It is now." The community hall buzzed with conversation. Farmers stood in small groups, discussing rainfall, fuel prices, seed orders, and harvest numbers. As several conversations slowed, not awkwardly, curiously. The same people who had watched her buy the rusted tractor now greeted her with friendly nods instead of amused smiles. One of the older farmers approached first. "I owe you an apology." Emma looked surprised. "For what?" "I laughed when you bought that tractor." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I figured you were throwing your savings away." Emma smiled gently. "You weren't the only one." The man chuckled. "No," he glanced around the room. "I think half this county thought the same thing later that afternoon." The local farming association invited several growers to share something they had learned during the season. Emma expected to stay in the audience. Instead, Carl raised his hand. "I think Emma should speak." The room agreed. Reluctantly, she walked to the front. She wasn't used to microphones. She certainly wasn't used to giving speeches. For a moment, she simply looked around the room. Many of the faces staring back at her had been at the auction. Some had laughed, some had shaken their heads, some hadn't believed she'd finished planting, let alone harvesting. Emma took a slow breath. "I think everyone here believes this story is about an old tractor." A few people smiled. "It isn't." The room grew quiet. "It's about something much easier to overlook." She paused. Patience, she explained how every evening she had inspected the tractor before going home. How she repaired small problems before they became expensive failures. How she chose dependable equipment she could understand instead of buying more than her farm could afford. She never claimed the old tractor was better than every new machine. Instead, she said something far simpler. The best equipment isn't always the newest. It's the one that lets you keep farming tomorrow. No one interrupted, no one argued, because every farmer in that room understood exactly what she meant. After the meeting ended, people gathered around her one by one, not to congratulate her, to ask questions. "What model is it exactly? Where did you learn to repair engines? How do you know when an old tractor is worth buying?" "Would you look at one I'm thinking about purchasing?" Emma answered every question honestly. Sometimes the answer was yes, sometimes it was no. She warned them that not every old tractor deserved saving. Some really were beyond repair. The important part wasn't buying something old. It was knowing what to look for before spending your money. Carl watched the crowd forming around her and smiled. You know what's funny? What? Carl laughed quietly. Nobody's talking about the paint anymore. Emma turned toward the parking lot. Her tractor sat exactly where she'd left it. The faded hood still wore patches of rust. The dented fenders hadn't magically straightened. The cracked seat was still covered with the same old canvas blanket she'd tied over it months before. Nothing about the machine looked different, yet somehow, everyone saw something completely different now. Not because the tractor had changed, because the evidence had as the sun began to set. Emma climbed into the familiar seat and started the engine. The old diesel settled into its steady rhythm. Farmers standing nearby stopped their conversations for a moment. Several smiled. One man tipped his hat, another simply nodded with quiet respect. Emma eased the tractor onto the road and headed home, the same road she had driven after the auction months before. Back then, laughter had followed behind her. Now only the sound of the engine remained, and somehow it sounded very different. Spring arrived sooner than Emma expected. The fields were waking again. Fence posts needed replacing, equipment needed servicing, seed orders covered the kitchen table. Another season was beginning. With it came another county farm auction. Emma almost stayed home. She didn't need another tractor. She certainly wasn't planning to spend money, but Carl convinced her to come anyway. "You'll want to see this," he said with a grin. Emma wasn't sure what he meant. The auction yard looked much the same as it had the year before. Rows of tractors, hay equipment, old wagons, pickup trucks, trailers. The smell of diesel drifted through the cool morning air. Only one thing felt different: the people. Months earlier, Emma had walked through these same rows almost unnoticed. Now heads turned as she entered. Several farmers waved. Others smiled and walked over to shake her hand. One of them laughed. "I've got someone I'd like you to meet." Standing beside an old blue tractor was a young couple who had recently purchased a small piece of land. The husband extended his hand. "We've heard about your tractor." Emma smiled politely. "I hope only the good parts," he laughed. "We're thinking about bidding on this one." He looked at the faded machine beside him. Would you mind taking a look before we decide?" Emma paused for a moment. Just a year earlier, no one had cared what she thought. Now people were asking for her opinion before spending their own savings. She walked slowly around the tractor. Exactly as her grandfather had taught her, she ignored the shiny paint someone had sprayed over the hood. Fresh paint could hide many things. Instead, she knelt beside the rear axle, checked for fresh leaks, looked underneath the engine, examined the steering linkage. Then she lifted the hood. The engine compartment told a very different story than the outside. Someone had cleaned it thoroughly, perhaps too thoroughly. Emma noticed fresh oil collecting beneath one side of the block, a temporary sealant-covered part of a coolant hose. The battery cables had been replaced, but several mounting bolts showed marks where repairs had been rushed. She closed the hood gently. The young couple waited nervously. "What do you think?" Emma smiled. "I think someone wanted this tractor to look ready." She rested a hand on the fender. "I'm not sure they spent the same effort making it ready." The couple thanked her and quietly stepped away from the bidding. 2 hours later, another buyer purchased the tractor for nearly twice what Emma had paid for hers the previous year. As the crowd dispersed, Carl leaned over. "You probably saved those kids a lot of money." Emma shrugged. "I may have." Carl smiled. "A year ago, people laughed because you bought an ugly tractor." He looked across the auction yard. "Today they ignored a pretty one because you asked the right questions." Emma laughed softly. "Funny how that works." Before leaving, the auctioneer caught up with her. "I've been meaning to thank you." Emma looked puzzled. "For what?" He nodded toward the growing crowd gathered around several older machines. Last year, people only looked at paint. He smiled. This year, they're opening hoods. Emma couldn't help laughing. The auctioneer continued. "I've seen more buyers checking engines this morning than I have in the last 10 years. He tipped his hat. "You changed something." Emma looked across the yard. Farmers were kneeling beside tractors, turning cooling fans by hand, looking underneath frames, checking hydraulic lines. Listening, observing, asking better questions, not because she had told them to, because they had learned that appearances could be expensive. On the drive home, Emma thought about her grandfather. From he had never written a book, never owned a large farm, never spoke at conferences. Yet one man's quiet habits had now reached people he would never meet. His lessons had traveled from one workshop, from to one granddaughter to an entire farming community. The old tractor rumbled steadily along the county road. Its faded hood still carried every scratch, every dent, every patch of rust. From Emma smiled as she rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel. The tractor had never really been the lesson. It had simply been the reason people were finally willing to learn one. Sometimes, the greatest investment isn't the machine you buy, it's the wisdom that teaches you how to choose it. Winter settled quietly over the valley. The fields that had been full of vegetables only weeks before now rested beneath a thin layer of frost. The garden beds stood empty. The corn stalks had been cut. The orchard had surrendered its last apples. For the first time in months, the farm slowed down. Emma welcomed the silence. She spent the colder mornings inside the barn, giving the old tractor the attention it deserved after an entire season of faithful work. She changed the engine oil, greased every fitting, adjusted the clutch, drained a little water from the fuel separator before it could freeze. None of it was difficult, none of it attracted attention. But these were the quiet habits her grandfather believed made the greatest difference. He used to say, "A machine doesn't ask for much. It only asks that you don't forget about it when everything is going well." Emma understood that now. Better than ever, she wiped the last bit of grease from her hands and stepped outside. Fresh snow had begun falling across the pasture. The farm looked peaceful. Almost too peaceful. After the busy months behind her, Carl's pickup rolled slowly into the driveway. He climbed out carrying a small wooden box. "I've got something for you." Emma opened it carefully. Inside lay an old brass wrench. Its handle was worn smooth from decades of use. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her grandfather. Carl smiled. "Your grandmother found it while cleaning the old workshop." Emma turned the wrench over in her hands. The edges were rounded. The finish had long since disappeared. It wasn't valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because of the hands that had used it. Carl looked toward the tractor, resting inside the barn. "You know," he paused for a moment, "I think everybody thought your story was about buying the right tractor." Emma smiled softly. "I thought so too." Carl frowned. "You don't anymore," she shook her head. No, she looked across the snow-covered fields. The tractor was only the beginning. Carl waited. Emma continued. It taught me that almost everything important on a farm works the same way." She pointed toward the compost pile resting beneath its winter cover. "Compost looks like waste." She looked toward the weathered fence posts. "Old lumber looks finished." She smiled at the tractor inside the barn, and "old equipment looks worn out." Then she looked back at Carl. "But if you take the time to understand what something still has to offer, you stop asking how old it is, you start asking what it's capable of." Carl nodded slowly. "I guess that's true for people too." Emma smiled. "I think that's where it's most true." The wind carried a few snowflakes through the open barn door. Inside, the old tractor sat exactly where it had sat after the auction nearly a year before. The paint was still faded. The hood was still scratched, the seat was still patched with heavy canvas. To someone passing by for the first time, it probably looked like an ordinary old tractor, maybe even one ready for retirement. Emma knew better. Not because the machine was perfect, but because she knew its story. She remembered the laughter at the auction, the doubts, the breakdown in the first field. The evenings spent cleaning filters and tightening bolts, the harvest that quietly answered every question. None of those moments had happened because of luck. They happened because someone had been willing to look beyond appearances. As the afternoon flight faded, Emma closed the barn doors and rested one hand against the tractor's worn fender. Her grandfather's words echoed gently in her memory. "Most people see what something is today. Farmers survive by seeing what it can become." She smiled. That lesson had never really been about machinery. It had been about land, about work, about people, and about hope. Because every season begins with something that doesn't look very promising, a handful of seeds, a patch of empty ground, an abandoned field, a rusty tractor at the edge of an auction yard. Most people walk past those things without a second glance. A few stop long enough to imagine what they could become. Those are the people who change farms. Sometimes they even change the minds of everyone around them. From outside, snow continued to fall across the quiet valley. Inside the barn, the old tractor waited patiently for another spring, not as a symbol of what had been saved, but as proof that real value is rarely found by the people who look only once. Sometimes, the greatest harvest isn't measured by the crops you bring home. It's measured by the way you've learned to see the world.